On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, in an extraordinary interview with Fox and Friends, President Trump defends Michael Cohen, who just pleaded the Fifth, rips James Comey, denounces the media, of course, and slams his own Justice Department.
You look at the corruption at the top of the FBI, it's a disgrace. And our Justice Department, which I try and stay away from, but at some point I won't. Our Justice Department should be looking at that kind of stuff, not the nonsense of collusion with Russia.
He's created a world of hurt in exchange for a half hour of free psychotherapy on Fox and Friends.
Well, politically, I actually think it makes a lot of sense for the president to talk to media outlets. I know he usually talks to Fox, but I think in many cases, the president is his own best spokesperson.
We'll analyze the fallout from this combative and quite unusual presidential phoner. The president's pick to run the VA bows out after a flood of allegations are leaked to the press. And Trump practically invites Ronny Jackson to withdraw over a process he calls disgusting.
Dr. Ronny L. Jackson is desperately in need of the credibility that he threw to the wind the day that he stood in the White House briefing room and praised the cheeseburger lifestyle of the obviously physically unfit president of the United States.
This is a message from the Democrats to the Trump administration. Anybody that you nominate, if you think about taking a job in this administration, we will wreck your life. We will wreck your life with very specific allegations from unnamed sources.
Have news outlets been unfair to the White House doctor by pushing these leaked and unconfirmed allegations? And is the press right that the president keeps putting up nominees without checking their backgrounds? A former NBC correspondent accuses Tom Brokaw of sexual misconduct.
I'm Linda Vester. For a decade, I worked at NBC News as an anchor and correspondent. I was groped and assaulted by Tom Brokaw.
And the former NBC anchor angrily denies the allegations, calling it a drive-by media shooting. Plus, the White House Correspondents' Dinner turns ugly as a cursing comedian savages the Trump team. Why this was truly a new low. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. There's been an avalanche of negative headlines after Ronny Jackson pulled the plug on his nomination to run the sprawling VA bureaucracy. This after a Senate committee started leaking allegations against him to the press, and less than 48 hours after the president suggested he might want to bow out.
But I told Admiral Jackson just a little while ago, I said, what do you need this for? This is a vicious group of people that malign, and they do. I don't want to put a man through a process like this. It's too ugly and too disgusting. I wouldn't do it. What does he need it for? To be abused by a bunch of politicians that aren't thinking nicely about our country?
Well, the White House physician decided he didn't need it, and after he withdrew, the president said this on Fox.
These are all false accusations that were made. These are false. They're trying to destroy a man.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Juan Williams, co-host of The Five. And Shelby Holliday, senior video reporter at The Wall Street Journal. Molly, the Washington Post headline after this: cabinet chaos engulfs Trump. So the larger media narrative here is that Donald Trump appoints people impulsively, they aren't adequately vetted, and this creates problems for the administration.
And it's not that that narrative is completely false. Obviously, there is chaos. We don't have a cabinet secretary at the Veterans Administration, and this is a very important cabinet. This is a very important agency that serves the health of all of our veterans. That's an important part of the story, how he's appointing people and how it's not working well, or how he's nominating people. At the same time, I think that larger narrative misses the point, which is that a lot of Americans voted for Trump precisely because he does things differently than the way they've been done in Washington, and that they're sick of business as usual in Washington, and they are looking for different ways to approach such issues as how veterans' health is taken care of.
So shaking things up has both positive and negative effects. Now, Juan, even before these allegations against Ronny Jackson surfaced, the media take was, how could he be named to run the VA, no management experience, Trump liked him because he praised his health? And then when these allegations surfaced, I mean, the media really pounced.
Well, I'm not sure I would say the media pounced, Howard, because remember, initially, it was simply the basis of the reports to the Senate saying that there were concerns over reports to the senators, and it was sort of up in the air. What are these allegations? Then subsequently, the reporting comes out based on leaks, if you will, coming out of the Senate that military people had gone to Senator Tester, and then the allegations, the flood started.
Right. Some of that is fair game, but then it turns out that some of these allegations about wrecking a car or being so drunk that he couldn't be roused are not true, or there's no evidence of that.
No, what we know is that the White House has said that subsequent...
The Secret Service has also said.
No, the Secret Service came back on the idea that he was banging on a door for a woman and could have waken her.
Everywhere.
Right. But guess what? We don't know. What we know is that principally the White House said these reports of drunken behavior, handing out pills like a candy man, they say it's not true. But wouldn't it have been better if he had been vetted earlier and they could have said right from the start, not true?
I think we can agree on that point. But Shelby, and now there were a whole bunch of nominees that were put up who had to withdraw, including one for Secretary of Labor, for Army Secretary, for Navy Secretary. But there is a New York Times story that says, for many, life on Trump team ends in a crash. And this is also part of this narrative that, for those who left the White House under a cloud or whatever, that working for the president isn't good for your reputation. It's not that it's not true in every case, but is that overstated in your view?
I don't think it's overstated, and I'm glad you're asking, because the big question now is, does Ronny Jackson stay on as White House doctor? It looks like he will, but there are still questions about whether or not... There's a much larger question about working for this administration. There is, and a lot of people feel that when they leave, they have been burned. Their reputation has been tarnished. Whether they have been sort of stabbed in the back and hung out to dry,
stabbed in the front,
or they left on their own accord because of some scandal or something that they disagreed with in the administration. So it's a tough place to work, but the White House is always a tough place to work. I would say there are still questions about this doctor. Does he hand out pills like candy? Is he drinking on the job? You would never want a doctor like that around the president of the United States.
This is actually kind of the whole problem here. Senator Jon Tester went out with anonymous allegations that in some cases have been actually disputed, in no cases have been verified, and yet the media are talking about them on air, acting like it's no concern to destroy a man's reputation. Senator Jon Tester is probably going to face a lot of tough questions for what he did from his Montana constituents. But he couldn't have done it without the media just carrying that for him.
So why did the president give him an off-ramp instead of
journalistic norms are being thrown out the window. You do not say this could be true and that could be true. Anything could be true. That's not the norm. You make sure something is true. A report based on anonymous sources. This is why it's important
the senator is who
to
came
verify
forward with those details.
Yes,
the senator came
he
forward
absolutely
with those
should be held accountable, because I think some credence was given to him in the same way credence was given to Harry Reid when he made up information about Mitt Romney's tax returns. That doesn't mean that journalists should just do this, though.
I do have to say there have been instances of Republicans on committees leaking allegations as part of their investigation. It's not unique. It's not solely the province of Democrats. The president, of course, now calling for Tester to resign and using words like very dishonest and sick. But the thing about Tester, he's the ranking Democrat on that committee. The Republican chairman, Johnny Isakson, he's the one who held up the hearing, and he says he has no problem with what Tester did. So there's not unanimity of opinion on this in the political world.
Not at all. And in fact, I think there's a lot of concern about the issue you raised at the very start of the show, qualifications. Does he have the management experience to run the second largest bureaucracy in Washington?
But that's now moot. What about Molly's point that the media were too willing, perhaps eager, to run with allegations, many of which were unconfirmed, that kind of ruined this guy's reputation?
I don't think for me, that's not the issue, because you had it coming from Jon Tester. You have it coming from an authoritative source.
Would you say the same thing if it was coming from Devin Nunes? Well, that's okay.
Yes. Are you kidding? Devin Nunes has been all over the papers, and in some cases later had to recuse himself.
But you're all right with the press running with this?
Yeah, because guess what? Somebody put their face and name, who was an elected American official, in this case a U.S. senator, put his name to it and said, here's what is coming.
Initially, I think some of this was just leaked, and then he went public. I want to turn to, so that we touch on this, this extraordinary spectacle of the leaders of North and South Korea meeting and talking about ending the war between them and perhaps moving forward with this denuclearization process, if that is true. Now, Donald Trump, as you know, Molly, battered by the media for months for taunting Little Rocket Man and all of that. Do you think the press is now giving the president at least some credit, with the caveats that we don't know what's going to happen, for the apparent progress on the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, they're giving some credit. I'm not sure if it's as much as should be. I saw the Daily Beast editor said, let's be honest, if Obama were accomplishing this, we'd be praising him. And I saw that CNN asked the foreign minister of South Korea, how is this happening so quickly? And she said, well, obviously all credit goes to Trump. And then to their credit, they wrote that story up based on what she said. But given that we were, and we talked about it on this show, talking about how much the media said that Donald Trump was bringing us to the brink of nuclear war a few months ago, with his rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think it's important to give that same level of coverage about what has apparently turned out to be a pretty successful approach this far. We have a lot that we don't know.
Very fair assessment. Now, what everyone's buzzing about here in D.C. is last night's White House Correspondents' Dinner. The president went to Washington, Michigan, talked to a rally, and as you might expect, he had some unfavorable things to say about the press. Take a look.
They don't have sources. The sources don't exist in many cases. I could be up there tonight smiling like I love where they're hitting you shot after shot. These people, they hate your guts.
All right, so he had a better time, but the media world is just filled with criticism now for comedian Michelle Wolf, who was cursing F-bombs on live television, personally cruel, in my view at least, to people like Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Kellyanne Conway who were there. You were at the dinner. I saw you. What's your take?
I thought that the level of sort of acerbic commentary directed at Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was sufficiently dignified to allow herself to be there. The president's not there.
Sit on the dais.
She is sitting there as a representative of that administration, and I thought she honored us as journalists with her presence, given the difficulty of the relationship, which should be adversarial, but it's a difficult relationship. And she decided to make herself available and present, and I think it was rude, you know, just as a human being, if I started speaking about Howard Kurtz in that way, I don't think it's appropriate.
You can say whatever you want about me, but rude is an understatement. And the president tweeting, everyone's saying it was a big, boring bust and the so-called comedian bombed. He wants Greg Gutfeld to be the comedian next year. I saw you there as well. What's your take on? I mean, this came now, I think, to define what otherwise would have been a nice, you know, a bunch of awards for journalists kind of thing. This came to define the White House Correspondents Association.
I thought that exact same thing when I was looking at Twitter this morning. She took it too far. Some of her attacks, especially with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, were very distasteful, made everybody uncomfortable. Journalists are among those who are most critical of this stand-up routine, if we want to call it that. But there were some really great parts of the dinner. Students are being honored. There are scholarships. I thought Margaret Tlaib gave a really great speech about them meeting the president and how President Trump received these journalists warmly. Those things are all overshadowed by some crude jokes that didn't need to be involved.
Overshadowed, obliterated.
Obliterated, yes.
I truly mean no offense, but I feel about the White House Correspondents' Dinner the way that most journalists feel about people like me, which is utter disdain. I thought that comedian's performance was not just rude, it was unfunny, which is the criminal issue, and also it's just such uneven comedy. Attacks on one group of people and just very light attacks on the media. If the White House Correspondents' Dinner wants to redeem its reputation, it needs to start being more heavy-hitting against itself.
No wonder,
well, the president could also show up and slam the press.
The president
that would be welcome.
Turn down the invitation. All right, let me get a break here. I'm getting some pretty nice online feedback for my new book, and with Mother's Day coming up, let me put in a little plug for Media Madness, Donald Trump, the press, and the war over the truth. When we come back, the president attacking Jim Comey, his own FBI and Justice Department, and the media, all unloading on Fox and Friends. And later, a former reporter's sexual misconduct allegations against Tom Brokaw and why NBC is struggling to address it. Was very much on offense in that phone interview with Fox and Friends, and he again went after Jim Comey and the Justice Department.
This is a big mistake, this book. He is guilty of crimes. And if we had a Justice Department that was doing their job, instead of spending
It's your Justice Department. Mr. President, you're the Republican in charge. You've got a Republican running it.
What I answer this all the time. What he did, Brian, was terrible. He leaked classified information in order to try and get a special counsel.
He says it wasn't classified, Mr. President.
Little pushback from Steve Doocy, Shelby Holiday. When the president goes off like that on the FBI and Comey, he says he's staying out of the justice for now, but he might not in the future. Is he giving ammunition to critics in the media who think he's trying to influence the investigation?
Absolutely, because he keeps playing with the idea that he might do something, and that hints that he might, yes, meddle in the investigation. I think it's a great point. I'm glad Steve pointed out it's your Justice Department. Everyone you're slamming here is a Republican in the Justice Department, and you have control over this, Mr. President. I think what people were surprised by, not so much the words that the president said in that interview, but his tone. When you just played the clip, you can hear how amped up he is you know, some people described it as hysterical. You can tell he's really passionate about this.
Hold on. It wasn't hysterical. It was certainly amped up. He was loud. He was ticked off, and this is his style.
Of course.
But I want to turn to Molly.
You can tell how much it's bothering him.
That part I can't dispute. The Federalists dug up some key information from this report by the House Intel Committee of Republicans about the whole dossier affair. It had to do with James Clapper, who was President Obama's Director of National Intelligence and the media. Explain.
Yeah, last week we talked about how James Comey's first memo said that Clapper asked him to do that briefing of the dossier to Trump. And he said in that memo, CNN is looking for a hook in order to justify writing about this.
News hook, correct.
This House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence had a report, both Democrats and Republicans contributed to this actually, showing that James Clapper did give inconsistent testimony, but admitted that he had been talking to Jake Tapper, one of the authors on that dossier story, which got everything going in early January. He'd lied about it. He'd given conflicting information. We're starting to see some pieces of the puzzle put together that show that there was a really high-level contact between journalists and key top officials during the Obama administration.
But you're not saying that CNN shouldn't have reported it, but you're saying that this was done in order to push the story out, that's what Clapper was doing?
I think it's a great example of how when you have anonymous sources asking you to do something to push their preferred narrative, you should be really skeptical about that. And you should make sure that you are thinking through why they're wanting to do something and whether your coverage accurately reflects the whole story.
Right. Now, it was a big story for CNN to report that the president had been briefed on this dossier and given a two-page summary, some dispute about that. But it's a pretty damning finding against Clapper, especially if he didn't tell the truth initially about his contacts with CNN, where he now works as a contributor.
Right, but I don't know that this is so different. I mean, obviously, when you're a reporter in Washington and you're trying to get sources, if you can get to Clapper, if you can get to Jim Comey as FBI director, or or Andrew McCabe, for example. McCabe was found to have lied about contacts with reporters, apparently
Wall Street Journal,
apparently unauthorized. But the idea that reporters, that an Anderson Cooper or whoever is going at these sources, and that the sources calculate about the impact of media exposure for a piece of information that was so explosive is not crazy.
But I would like to add, we know that the man who wrote the dossier was briefing reporters, including CNN, earlier that year, and that is likely why CNN had the information in the first place.
Right, but this thing about a news hook and Clapper not telling the truth, according to this report, and getting it to CNN as a way of putting it out, raises a whole set of questions. Shelby Holiday, Juan Williams, Molly Hemingway, thanks very much for coming by this Sunday. Ahead, the president blows off last night's White House Correspondents' Dinner, as we said, and he counter-programs with a media-bashing rally. We'll talk more about that, but up next, Tom Brokaw is angry and hurt over allegations that he sexually harassed a former NBC reporter, but Linda Vester says she was scared and traumatized.
Former NBC correspondent accuses Tom Brokaw of making unwanted advances toward her 2 decades ago.
That was the Today Show report. Linda Vester, a former NBC correspondent, is making gripping allegations of sexual misconduct against Tom Brokaw. Allegations that the veteran anchor strongly denies. In interviews with Variety and The Washington Post, Vester says that in the 1990s, Brokaw groped her and then on 2 separate occasions in 2 different cities, got physical with her.
I grabbed the throw pillow and I'm like this to show with all the body language I can muster that I'm terrified. I don't want him here. I'm not interested. Reached behind my head and tried to force me to kiss him. I pulled back with all the strength I could muster and stood up. And I said, Tom, I do not want to do this with you.
Joining us now in New York, Marisa Guthrie, TV editor for The Hollywood Reporter. And Marisa, when you look at that very emotional 13-minute video interview by Linda Vester, who later hosted a show at Fox News, doesn't NBC have a major problem on its hands?
It's very detailed, it's very graphic, it's very specific, and the allegations were substantiated by friends and by journal entries. Yeah, she paints a very troubling picture.
Right.
Absolutely.
At the same time, I want to be fair to Tom Brokaw here. You obtained a letter at The Hollywood Reporter that the former anchor had written to some friends and colleagues at 4 in the morning, apparently. And here's some of it. We'll put it on the screen. I was ambushed and perp-walked across the pages of the Washington Post and Variety as an avatar of male misogyny, taken to the guillotine, stripped of any honor and achievement I had earned. I am angry, hurt, and unmoored from what I thought would be the final passage of my life and career. She has unleashed a torrent of unsubstantiated criticism and attacks on me. Brokaw obviously is entitled to defend himself, but not really any conciliatory language in that note.
No, he really tore her down in that letter. And yes, he is entitled to defend himself. This is an allegation from more than 20 years ago. There is a second anonymous allegation also from around the same time period that was in the Washington Post story.
Right, a woman who is not named, yes.
A woman who's not named. I think what the letter represents is somebody desperately trying to, afraid that they're going to lose their legacy. But what it also represents, I think, is this kind of old school grandiosity that, you know, all the good things you've done in your life and all the accomplishments, and both, Tom has both, obviously, negates the handful of stupid things that you did. I mean, why are you in the hotel room of a 28-year-old correspondent? So I think that's what a lot of people are grappling with right now.
Now, you know, I covered Tom Brokaw for a long time. He had an amazing journalistic career, but you can't completely whitewash this. I know that 60-plus women have signed a letter support for Brokaw, including Andrea Mitchell and Rachel Maddow and others. But let me just play one more soundbite from Linda Vester. You can respond on the other side.
I was deeply traumatized by being groped and assaulted by Tom Brokaw. I was silenced. And there was nothing I could do to seek recourse, because to have done so at NBC would have been the end of my career. Full stop.
People say, why is she doing this now? I mean, she's not suing, she's not asking for money, and NBC doesn't have an outside investigation of this or Matt Lauer or any of this. They're using an in-house executive.
Right, they're using Kim Harris, who's the general counsel at NBC Universal, so in corporate. And that's been a criticism, that they have not hired an outside investigator. Other networks have not. I know, obviously, Fox News did with Roger Ailes. So, yeah, they are opening themselves up to criticism by not hiring an outside investigator.
Yeah, let me just jump in here because we're short on time. That Washington Post story also talked about other allegations against Matt Lauer, of course, was fired about 5 months ago. Ann Curry went on the record saying she had told executives about a woman who claimed she was being harassed by Lauer. And Lauer issued this statement saying many false stories about him. I acted inappropriately as a husband, father, and principal at NBC, but any allegations, says Matt Lauer, of coercive, aggressive, or abusive actions are false. Quick thought on that.
Well, I think that, you know, a lot of this is the man interpreting it differently than the woman, because it has obviously a different effect on the woman. When she's trying to fend off somebody who's in a position of power over her. So I think, you know, I think it's good that we're having this conversation, and that's why I think the letter that all the women signed is an interesting inflection point, because everybody's been terrified to talk about this.
Well, I think that's
and we need to talk about it.
I totally agree with that part. Marisa Guthrie, thanks. Ahead on Media Buzz, the New York Times campaign reporter who says Hillary hated her, yet she still wanted Clinton to win. But first, a crude comedian is a disaster, as we were just talking about. The White House Correspondents' Dinner, Ed Henry, is on deck.
I think we deliver real, honest, strong opinion day after day, night after night on Fox, and the viewers expect that. They know with me they're going to get a straight shooter, no holds barred. I'm not going to cut people slack, but I'll also be fair. It's a place where we have real debate, and we really respect the traditions that made this country great.
Last night's White House Correspondents' Dinner turned into a travesty when comedian Michelle Wolf turned in a crude and cursing performance that not only trashed the president, but such aides as Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who's sitting right there on the dais, and Kellyanne Conway.
If a tree falls in the woods, how do we get Kellyanne under that tree? I'm not suggesting she gets hurt, just stuck.
Joining us now, Ed Henry, Fox's chief national correspondent and a past president of the White House Correspondents Association. We were both there at the dinner. I've never seen a performance like that. She was not only nasty, but she was dropping F-bombs on live television carried by CNN, MSNBC. What's your take as someone who's gone through this process?
Even worse, she was joking about abortion. I won't even repeat the jokes. They were so vile. Bottom line is, I understand Margaret Tlaib as president. I respect her. It's a tough job. You're up there. You pick the comedian. And there is a First Amendment in this country, whether you like it or not. And sometimes they're going to say, First Amendment protects stupid and vile things as well. However, I think it's long past time. Here we are, hours later, for the association to put out a simple one-sentence statement saying, we do not agree with this. These personal, vile attacks on Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is a good person. Dare I say that if Hillary Clinton had been elected and Jennifer Palmieri were up there and got all these personal attacks about your appearance, and I won't even add and dignify.
I don't even want to play it.
It's ridiculous.
I don't even want to play it.
And so the association should apologize. Period. Stop.
Okay, I agree with you on that. You know who else agrees with you is Andrea Mitchell, who just tweeted apologies owed to Press Sec, Sarah Sanders, and others.
We invited her in.
Grossly insulted by Michelle Wolf. Comedian was the worst since Imus insulted Clinton.
We invited her to dinner. We should have treated her with respect. I don't need to say anything beyond that.
Right,
Treat her
and
with
it casts a
respect.
stain on the whole event. I mean, whatever nice things
We're talking about the First Amendment and valuable things. By the way, and I'm hearing this on social media, I am not letting the president off the hook. When he said the press is the enemy of the American people months and months ago, that was not right. He shouldn't have said that. You might disagree with individual stories to tar the entire media, including me, including you, that we're the enemy of the American people. I'm not letting him off the hook about that.
Right.
But we should show respect to the president. We should show respect to the press secretary. I shouldn't even have to say that. That's elementary. And people right now are not doing that. And she is a press secretary. She's a professional woman. She puts herself out there. Attack her for what she says about Syria. Attack her on substance. Do not attack her personally.
Right, and I give comedians a wide berth, but this was just so far beyond the pale. And by the way, Michelle Wolf not apologizing. She just went on Twitter.
She'll make more money off this.
Yeah, well, she wants to be famous. She went on Twitter and said, I was actually complimenting Sarah Sanders' eye makeup.
Right, ridiculous.
Yeah.
But here's my bottom line point. The White House Correspondents Association can be, could be, and should be better than a gutter comedian.
Right. And Margaret Talv of Bloomberg, the president, is not apologizing. So
I hope she will.
We'll see if that changes.
Before tomorrow's briefing, issue an apology.
Let me move now to the president's Fox and Friends interview, because one thing that drew a lot of attention was what he had to say about his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. Take a look.
Michael would represent me and represent me on some things. He represents me like with this crazy Stormy Daniels deal.
So a lot of certain journalists saying he previously distanced himself from that case. Now he's saying Michael Cohen did represent him. Are journalists right that was a misstep?
Well, I don't think it's a shock that Michael Cohen represented him. We know this. There are documents. So people are kind of overplaying that. However, where the president continues to kind of misstep there, I think, is, from a media perspective, I've never seen any public figure comment on a legal matter and it go well for them. Your lawyers tell you, let that play out in the court, don't get involved, and I think he pours gasoline on whatever fire might be out there when he comments. And so, but on the other hand, I spoke to the president because it was Take Your Daughter to Work Day, I think that same day, and he told me, look, I was on Fox and Friends for a half hour, and then every other network, he told me in private, played the whole thing, and even though they were criticizing him, he doesn't care. He said everybody was talking about everything I had to say, and he said he told me he's going to do more of it.
He says, Kellyanne Conway says he may call into Fox and Friends once a month. It was on all the cable networks, almost in real time. Here's how CNN handled it. Let's put up the banner from Don Lemon's show. We got that? President Trump's unhinged interview.
This is where, I just, again, I'm not giving him a pass. I think his comments on Michael Cohen probably didn't help him. Okay. But the bottom line is, you see this with banners more and more at some other networks.
He's
crazy.
See this, he's a madman.
Crazy, unhinged. Right. There is the idea of fair and balanced coverage. I'm just laughing. It's not even close.
Has gone out the window.
Out the window.
I know Don Lemon doesn't like him, but the banner is supposed to be kind of like a neutral headline. All right, you used to shout questions at presidents. Take a quick look at ABC's Jonathan Karl asking one the president didn't like.
Mr. President, what about Michael Cohen? Are you considering a pardon?
Thank you very much.
Stupid question. Go ahead. Anybody else, please?
Pardon for Michael Cohen. Stupid question, says the president.
It's a fair question. It's inbound. Again, president has First Amendment right to say what he wants, by the way. I'm not criticizing that, but I know John Karl. I've worked with John Karl. I'll try to do a Lloyd Benson kind of thing. I respect John Karl, and he's a fair journalist.
Yeah, I just didn't think it was a question that was going to get an answer. But.
Yeah, but it didn't mean it was a stupid
All right. Ed Henry, good to see you last night at dinner. Great to see you today.
Good to see you again.
Coming up, Joy Reid under fire for some really ugly anti-gay writings years ago. And after the break, New York Times reporter Amy Chozick uncovering Hillary Clinton while resenting her own paper's reporting on the email scandal. For all the intense focus on Donald Trump's war with the media, Hillary Clinton had some pretty hostile relations with her press corps, described by one reporter who concluded, quote, She really, really hates me. Joining us now from New York is Amy Chozick of the New York Times, author of the new book, Chasing Hillary, 10 years, 2 presidential campaigns, and 1 intact glass ceiling. And Amy, you write in the book, it felt damn good to bask in the girl power when Hillary Clinton clinched the nomination. You describe your own coverage as neutral to positive, with plenty of wet kisses thrown in. And then you say when you wrote your last story after the election, you finally cried. So did you feel compromised at all as a reporter covering this candidate who you passionately believed in?
Well, I want to clarify. I cried at the end because I was absolutely exhausted. I did not cry, and I make clear in the book it's not because Hillary lost. I mean, look, if you read the book, you know that there was an incredibly contentious relationship between Hillary Clinton and the political press, and Hillary Clinton, and specifically the New York Times, and my position as the lead beat reporter. I mean, she had called the political press back in the 90s big egos and no brains, and I think that tension kind of carried over and really spilled over into that UN press conference when she had to address the private email server for the first time.
Well, since you bring that up, let me jump in and we'll come back to that. You say, again, I'm just quoting from your book, the email scandal, broken by the New York Times, by the way, you initially thought it had no more national importance than Bristol Palin's pregnancy, and you went on to say that it wasn't a non-story, but you said I would regret and even resent that it became the only story. So you had some problems with the coverage.
No, I didn't compare it to Bristol Palin's pregnancy. I was comparing it to other scandals I had covered and sort of the volume of this scandal. I mean, this is not specific to the New York Times, but, you know, the email server became the only story, and I think that there were plenty of other things that, you know, the public should have known about Hillary Clinton. So eventually I did grow to kind of resent that was the only thing anyone was talking about.
Right.
That's
well,
not
perhaps
positive or negative. That's just the fact that there were probably other things.
Perhaps it was harder to tell other things about Hillary Clinton because you had such a tortured relationship with her, and she gave so little access to the press corps.
Completely.
But since the book came out, as you know, Chelsea Clinton says you got a few things wrong, including that she was popping the champagne cork on election night when she said she was home with her baby. That's a pretty key detail.
Well, you know, and I identified with Chelsea since I have my 8-week-old baby at home right now. I mean, look, Howie, let's speak to the broader theme of the book, which is, you know, they were attacking the book before it even came out and attacking the reporting in it. And I have a lot of respect for Chelsea. I've covered this family for a decade. I kept copious notes. I went above and beyond what most authors do, which is hire a fact checker. And so I think, you know, some of the fighting over champagne and hair treatment speaks to the broader themes of the book.
Okay. Now you write that Hillary Clinton's coterie of mostly male aides sometimes taunted you, made crude remarks toward you. Now, we know that one of them is Philippe Reines, who was on this program last week, and I asked him about that, and he said he pleaded guilty. But why didn't you name them the book? You give them these various nicknames. I mean, it almost seems like you're protecting them.
Well, and as I explain in the author's note, I didn't give these guys nicknames because I was protecting their anonymity. You've made a connection that you think one of them is one of Hillary's aides. I mean, the point is kind of a literary one.
I know who it is. I know who it is because you say in the book that he also, you know, played in the debates, and he acknowledges, Philippe Reines acknowledges.
Right, but this wasn't about granting anonymity. This was about, for a reader, an average reader. My mom's book club in Texas, for instance. These guys all have similar descriptions, white, clean cut, about the same age. They all played the same role in my life, which was controlling coverage, very much trying to get in my head. And so as a literary device, they really became this kind of tragicomic Greek chorus. And so, you know, I thought for the story, it would resonate with readers more to give them kind of monikers.
Here's a quote. I adopted Hillary's mood. I went around despondent and aggrieved, pissed off at the world, at my editors, at myself for not being likable enough.
Yeah. I mean,
doesn't sound like fun.
There's an instinct, a distinctly female instinct to want to be likable, and I do think any campaign reporter who's embedded with their candidate, I mean, there's often kind of, you pick up the mood of the campaign, and that was a particularly joyless, as Democrats describe it, joyless period in Hillary Clinton's campaign. And so when you're traveling everywhere she is, going to all these rallies, you can't help but sort of adopt that mood. I mean, I write that my colleagues on the Bernie bus were exuding this confidence of a budding insurgency, and we had the feeling of a dreary mechanical slog a lot of the time.
Right. I want to clear the air on one thing. You were on this program a year ago, and, 4 years ago. And then after Roger Ailes died last year, you wrote a piece saying the Fox gave you all this makeup, and this was part of Roger Ailes' plan for sexing up female reporters. I mean, I've been on every network, and the makeup people all try to make women and men look good. Looking back, any regrets about that cheap shot?
Look, I love the Fox News makeup artists. They make me look great. I'm incredibly grateful. I'm getting very little sleep with a newborn, and they really, you know, turn me into being almost TV ready, I think. So absolutely not. That was not a shot at the makeup team, who work hard, and they're really good at their jobs.
Well, they do work hard, and they are good at their jobs, which was, I thought it was an unfortunate anecdote. But I will say you're very candid in this book about your tortured relationship with Hillary and your own feelings, and even your own feelings about your newspaper. So Amy Chozick, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. After the break, a cultural milestone as one of America's great entertainers is found guilty of sexual assault. The Cosby verdict next. Cosby's retrial on sexual assault charges have been getting remarkably little media attention until the verdict was announced.
A verdict in the retrial of comedian Bill Cosby. The man has now been found guilty on all charges against him.
We are vindicated, we are validated, and we are now part of the tsunami of women's power and justice. We are not shutting up, and we're not going away. Get over it.
I thank you all in the media. You are the pillars of democracy. Without you, none of this would have happened.
Two of the accusers there. And joining us now from New York is Carly Shimkus, a reporter for Fox News 24/7 Headlines on Sirius XM. So there's been almost a universal media celebration about this guilty verdict, despite the fact that many journalists, including me, you know, had affection for him growing up as a comedian, as TV's Dr. Huxtable. What makes this such a cultural moment?
Well, symbolically, this trial is really so important because Bill Cosby is the first famous man to be found guilty of sexual misconduct following the Me Too movement. You know, I'd like to think, and I do believe, that he would have been found guilty regardless, but everything that happened with Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey could have been in the back of jurors' minds, because now they know that this happens a lot, and this happens a lot in Hollywood.
Right, but on that point, he wasn't found guilty the last time, before the Me Too movement exploded, before Weinstein and Kevin Spacey and Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose and so many others. Now, there was another difference this time. It was a different climate, to be sure. But also, there was several other Cosby accusers. We heard a couple of them there were allowed to testify, as opposed to just Andrea Constand, who was the focus of the prosecution.
That's right. So there were 5 other women that were allowed to testify against Bill Cosby in this case, and the DA even called those women the difference makers, because then prosecutors could sort of create the narrative that Andrea Constand was just part of a pattern of behavior that Bill Cosby used. Also, Cosby hired a different legal team, and they used a very different tactic where they attacked the witnesses' character instead of their claims, suggesting Andrea Constand was a gold digger and calling another witness somebody who slept around. So that sort of below-the-belt tactic did not work in this case.
Right, because we'd already had a $3 million settlement with Andrea Constand.
Absolutely.
But, you know, as this thing unfolded, I was reading some of it on the inside pages of the newspapers. I mean, it received remarkably little media attention. Now, was that because it came to be seen as old news and we had sort of been through the first trial, or was it just kind of a misjudgment by the press?
Well, you know, no, I think that there were a couple reasons. Of course, the main is because there is so much news coming out of Washington right now. This is a retrial, like you said, so we've lived through this testimony before. Also, Bill Cosby is 80 years old. He's in poor health, and his legacy has already been destroyed. So the impact of a guilty verdict is much less than if this happened at the peak of his career.
Right. He'd already been convicted, clearly, in the court of public opinion, but not yet in a court of law. And then, so finally, you know, looking at this, though, I think there's been a tendency, some New York Times had a good story on this, to think that this is now the precedent for other kinds of cases, when it may be rather unique to Cosby, as opposed to when you have a defendant who's not particularly famous.
Right. Well, you know, I do think that every trial will be, you know, judged fairly and equally. And you're right. People keep on calling this a precedent. I don't necessarily think that you can make that case, but I'm sure that Harvey Weinstein did look at this verdict, and he did feel very nervous for his own future, because there are so many similarities between these two men and how often they use their power to assault women and how often this happened. So I do think that, you know, wherever Harvey Weinstein is right now, he's probably very nervous. A
very different climate. Carly Shimkus, thanks very much. Great to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Still to come, is MSNBC's Joy Reid telling the truth about some extremely embarrassing posts from her past?